Thank you very much, Grace, for speaking with me today. First of all, congratulations on publishing your debut, Portrait of a Thief. You're telling a very interesting story here about 5 young Chinese Americans who were recruited by a Chinese benefactor to steal back some Chinese arts that were looted from Beijing centuries ago. How did you come up with this story idea?
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm so excited for our conversation. This book is actually inspired by a true story. And so several years ago, I learned about how Chinese art was getting stolen from these museums around the world, and no one knew who was behind it, but all the pieces of art that was getting stolen had originally been looted from China before. And so I was immediately fascinated by this story.
It's very interesting that you were inspired by true stories, but in those real-life heists, the thieves have not been identified yet, as you just said. So why did you make your characters Chinese Americans?
I think for me, I started writing this book when I had recently graduated college, and I wanted to write a story that, was about people like me and my friends. Growing up, I didn't read many books that featured Chinese Americans, and it wasn't until college that I really learned that stories could be by us and about us, and I wanted to write something like that.
Sure. It's also a good way to examine the complexity of Chinese American identity, right? I think you've done a pretty good job in showcasing, various types of Chinese Americans. The 5 main characters each has their own, relationship with China, their own cultural background, and their, family issues. I think it shows that Chinese Americans are not a monolith. Was that your intention when developing your characters?
Yes, definitely. That was something that was very purposeful on my end, just because I think that there's such a diversity of experiences within the Chinese American experience, and so I wanted to capture a part of that within my book and really make sure that these 5 characters had different backgrounds and different reasons for embarking upon this journey.
But all your characters actually went to top schools, Harvard, Stanford, Duke, and MIT, right? Like your own family. So have you thought about breaking some sort of model minority stereotype?
Yeah, so in putting that together, part of it is just, some of it was based on, my own experiences growing up, but also I wanted to talk about the pressures that a lot of Chinese Americans feel, and this idea that once you make it to a top school, that is success, or that's, all that you need, because a lot of the characters, even though they are, finishing up college or they're in a job, they still don't feel completely satisfied with their life. And so I wanted to untangle this idea of achievement and ambition versus what self-fulfillment and happiness is.
Speaking of the pressure, I noticed that all the 5 main characters, they also have some sort of identity struggle for being Chinese Americans. Oftentimes they feel like they don't belong anywhere. How does this struggle, identity struggle, play into their decision to get on board with these art heists?
Yeah, I love this question because I think that the heist can really be thought of this extended metaphor. We have this art that has been looted from China, and these Chinese Americans who get to bring back this art. And so it was very meaningful to me to have these characters who are trying to figure out what home means, to take this art and to return it to China.
Somehow it reminds me a survey I just read, which shows that Americans are more likely to question the loyalty of Asian Americans. I remember 1/3 of respondents think that Asian Americans are more loyal to their perceived country of origin than to the United States. Of course, this kind of perception is very much problematic. But in your book, there are 5, Chinese Americans who were recruited by a Chinese benefactor. They are stealing arts from American museums to get them back to China. Are you afraid that it can be interpreted into a case of Chinese Americans lacking loyalty to the United States?
I've never so much thought of it that way because I guess to me, I I was born in the US, I was raised here, I consider myself, fully American. And I think it's a very American, mentality to think that, this art doesn't belong in the museums that it's at currently, and so it ought to be returned. I don't think it's specific to questions of loyalty to which country, but just overall what is ethical in terms of us as people and us as citizens of the world.
So I think it's more like a reflection on colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
Also some like ethical issues involved, right? For example, is it legitimate to commit a crime in order to correct the mistakes or injustice happened in the past? Have you given a thought on this?
Yeah, so I think that in the real world, what I hope is that museums have these conversations and make the decisions on their own. But of course, that wouldn't be as interesting of a story. And so in the book, these characters commit these crimes. And I think that's an ongoing question that I hope readers of the book will also grapple with.
Let's talk more about identity struggle we were talking about before. In the survey I was referring to, it shows that Asian Americans are among the least likely to feel like they belong and are accepted in the United States. Is that something you can relate to from your personal experience?
Yeah, I think like many Asian Americans growing up here, when I was growing up, I would often get questions about where I was really from, or I would get compliments on my English, and I would constantly feel like even though I considered myself fully American, many other people didn't see me that way. And at the same time, I would go visit my family in China, and they would ask me well-meaning questions about whether I could speak Chinese or whether I could use chopsticks. And so with those two put together, I would feel sometimes like I didn't have a place in either China or America. And so that struggle was something that I thought about a lot growing up, and I put into my book because I wanted the characters to go through that same journey and also make it to the end with self-acceptance.
Have you talked about this with your parents? Are they feeling the same? Because they are the first generation of immigrants, so their feeling might be different from yours. Is that it?
Yeah, I have had these conversations with my parents, and especially so, I think, in recent years with the conversations about around COVID and what it means to be Asian American in the United States right now. And it's very interesting to me because when people ask me, where I'm from, I consider myself American, but to my parents, they were born and raised in China, and so that question, doesn't have the same layers to them as it does to me.
As you grow up, there were times when the U.S. and China were more on friendly terms, and also times when the bilateral relationship is deteriorating as what we have right now. Do you feel like the change or the increasing tension between the two countries is making the identity struggle of Chinese Americans more complicated?
Yes, I absolutely think it's making things more difficult, just because if you even look at recent years and with COVID and what was going on before with all the anti-Asian racism and the attacks, and I think it makes for a very scary time to be Chinese American here and to be Asian American, because it's a lot of hatred and fear and discrimination that previously existed but is now coming more to the surface, and now other people are more comfortable expressing that. And so it definitely is a big concern, I think, for me and many people of my generation and Chinese Americans.
I think there is another layer of identity struggle, that is to find who I am, what I want, versus what my parents are expecting from me. Of course, this is a universal struggle faced by almost all the young adults, but particularly for the second generation of Chinese Americans, because they also carry the weight of being their parents' American dream. I feel like it also gives some incentives to your characters to take this adventure, right?
Yes, absolutely. That is something that I personally am constantly thinking about, just because my parents grew up in China and came here for their education. And growing up, I felt a lot of pressure that was never really spoken, and yet I still felt like they had come so far and achieved so much that I felt like I had to do the same. I had to be their American dream. And it's only now that I'm a little older and I'm having more conversations with them that I'm realizing that their hopes for me are really just my own happiness and my own fulfillment. And so I wanted my characters to also grapple with similar things where they both feel that pressure but also have to come to terms with that and to realize that maybe it'll be okay.
Conducting the heist for your characters is not only a rebellion, but also a process of making peace with themselves, right?
Yes.
That's why Will Chen and I don't want to spoil too much, but it seems like at the end he said this is the first time he feels like satisfied with his life. Being a med student at Stanford by day and a published writer by night can be an adventure for you. Have you discovered more of yourself by writing this book?
Yes, I definitely have. I originally, when I was writing this book, I didn't know what would come of it. I started writing it because I wanted to read a book like this where Chinese American characters could go on an adventure and pull off a heist and also think about their identity and make peace with what it means to be Chinese American. So I really wrote this book for me, and it means so much that I now get to share it with other people.
This novel is currently in development at Netflix as you're serving as an executive producer. How is it going?
It is going well. I'm not sure how much I am allowed to reveal, but I will say that I'm very excited about the direction that the Netflix team is going in. And one of the reasons why I chose to go with Netflix was because they really had an emphasis on Asian American identity and voices and making sure that the show would accurately reflect the themes and the issues in the book. So I'm very excited about what they're doing.
Yeah, I read about Netflix has put a lot of efforts recently in telling more Asian American stories. But overall, do you think the Asian Americans and the Chinese Americans particularly, their stories have still been underrepresented in American film industry?
Yes, absolutely. I think that the change that's happening right now is very welcome, but also long overdue. There are so many Asian American stories and Chinese American stories that are still waiting to be told. So I feel very lucky to be part of that in some small way, and I feel also very hopeful that we will get more of our stories down the line.
All right, thank you very much, Grace.